Okay, welcome back to Research Methods. This is an interview exercise. And the first thing to understand is that we will be planning for a hypothetical interview rather than conducting an actual interview. Please copy all of your work from author to the last of the questions, stopping before example checklist interview portion of this document. So you're going to actually be putting your name in here and then talk about the beginning stages of the interview process. As always, it's helpful to begin by asking a few basic questions. As a draft for creating an interview, please provide a concise response to the following. So, what is the purpose of the interview I will be conducting? You would write the purpose there. Given my purpose, who is the best person to interview? And you might make a list of a few individuals that would be good to interview. Then consider where you might interview them. Of course, you won't know until you make arrangements, but try to envision the kind of environment you may be conducting the interview in. Is it formal, informal? Is it a place familiar or unfamiliar to the subject in the interview? For example, is it in their home? Is it in a place of business or on site? Is it a professional studio environment? Write a brief description of the kind of space or place, I should say, that you will be having as your interview context. Now, in that place or space, from your perspective, is it ideal? Why or why not? So, since this is hypothetical, we would probably be writing what the ideal space would be. Briefly reflect on your relationship to the subject of the interview. Do you know them personally or not? Do you have anything in common with the subject of the interview? Do you think that any of the things you have in common or that you will that you do not have in common will impact the interview? So yes, your knowledge of the person, perceived commonalities, all these things can indeed impact the interview. So jot down how you think they could. This is a way of preparing yourself to think of what you might need to do to make the interview context equitable and welcoming. In what ways will similar and different life experiences and perspectives possibly impact the interview? So, again, this will depend on who you're hypothetically interviewing, but those are important questions to ask, and you would answer them. Obviously, you might need a little bit more space. So, when you're completing this form, you would do that. Okay. So lastly, in some ways, and in some ways, most importantly, think about the technology you will be using to record the interview session. This is rather important, actually. Are you and the subject likely to be made more or less comfortable by the type of technology used to record the interview? That is a pretty important factor. Most people aren't very comfortable having a film camera, for example, aimed at them in a real life, real time setting. Some people are comfortable being taped, some not. Using Zoom applications has been quite popular. I know a lot of students use FaceTime for phone calls. So think about the technology and who you're going to be working with and what might make them comfortable. After having reflected on these details, begin to think of the kinds of questions you might ask. Consider the topic of your research and whom you might be interviewing. Imagine you only are allowed to ask one question of them. What would it be? Please write that question down. Now, for your particular interview instrument, you're going to have to write more than one, but just imagine if you could only ask one. What's the most important one? Then this is the section. This previous session is kind of workshopping, and we will be sharing that in our group discussion if you attend a real-time session. However, this part from here uh, to sorry, to there, just this page basically is something you're going to be copying into that ongoing comprehensive report form. So this is where you're really drafting that interview instrument. So you'll need today's date or whatever date that you're completing this. The interviewer's name is your own name, your research topic, who the subject, the hypothetical subject is, what the hypothetical interview date is, and then what questions you might want to ask of them. This is an example checklist for an interview. This is the sort of thing that you would use if you were doing a real interview. And you might Before the interview, ask if you've submitted to the university permission forms for the research proposal, if they've been accepted. Has the research been explained to the subject of the interview? Have interview questions been completed and sent to the subject ahead of time? Has the time and context for the interview been agreed upon? Have your recording methods been approved by both the university and the subject of the interview? Have you prepared a permission for publication form for the subject of the interview to sign? And that's rather important too. You need to have their permission as to how you are allowed to use the information from the interview and in what format. Post-interview, do you have the signed permission for publication form from the subject of the interview? Have you just transcribed the interview? Do you have the transcription of the interview to the subject of the interview for review and acceptance? So in other words, does the person who you interview have they seen the work? Did they accept the work? And have you received acceptance of the transcription from the interview by the subject for use in publication? So the subject has a right to decide what portions of the interview are okay for publication. So you need to tell them basically what it is you intend to use, and then you have to be sure they've said it is okay. You need separate permission for each medium you propose to publish. So for example, if you have a videotaped interview, you need to have permission to use that footage. And if you intend to publish it online, where you intend to publish it. Stages and essential practices of conducting interview for research. A successful interview often happens in stages. Preparation is very important. There are certain practices and questions common to most interview. Stage 1, before interviewing. Make sure that you have completed all of the previously mentioned steps to securing permission from the university and the subject of the interview. Make sure that all the recording equipment is working as non-intrusively as possible. One of the most basic causes of a failed interview session is faulty equipment. It may have been the most helpful interview you've ever had, but if you're unable to document that information from the interview for the purposes of Euro-Western academics, it's not very useful to the support of your project. Additionally, if the subject is uncomfortable with the presence of the equipment, the interview will probably not be very useful. As best possible, make sure the interview context is comfortable. The comfort, both physical and psychological, of the interview context is not something that the interviewer will always have control over, but the comfort of the environment sets the tone for the interview sessions and often determines the success or failure of the interview session. To the best of your ability as a researcher, however, it is important to make certain that the interview context, where and how the interview takes place, is as safe and comfortable as possible. Stage 2, during the interview. Put yourself and the subject of the interview at ease. This is often the first practical activity of any interview. Even adversarial interviews, such as police interrogations, begin by trying to put the subject of the interview at ease, making sure that both yourself and the subject of the interview understand the purpose of the interview and the questions that will be involved in the interview before the interview takes place. This is a part of the process. Again, having made sure that the interview context is physically comfortable is also important. Most researchers will begin the interview session by welcoming the subject, thanking them for their willingness to be interviewed, and reminding the interview subject of the purpose of the interview. Most researchers will briefly go over the questions that will be discussed before beginning recording. It's very important to ask the interviewee if they are ready to start the recorded portion of the interview before starting the recorded portion of the interview. So ask if they're ready before you start. Be courteous. Even if you disagree with the view of the person you're interviewing, always be, as best possible, courteous. This may involve doing a little research in advance. Different cultures have varying notions of what it means to express respect. Some cultures, for example, consider eye contact confrontational, whereas other cultures view it as an affirmation that they are being affirmed and listened to. They're being respected and listened to. Listen carefully with all of your senses. Try to be aware not only of the content of what is being said, but also body posture, tone of voice, facial expressions, and what is not being said. So Pay attention to what's being said as well as what's not being said. If the subject of the interview is deflecting a great deal, that is not actually answering your questions or frequently changing the topic, you need to decide how important your scripted questions are. Is there something being communicated by the subject of the interview, perhaps more important than what you're asking them? If you really do need specific questions you've scripted to be answered, then try either gently redirecting the question or, worst case scenario, thank the subject of the interview for their time and seek another interview subject. Always express gratitude. Always thank the subject of the interview for their time and help. Stage 3, after the interview, transcribe the interview. This is where a bit of tedious work comes in, although not as much today, actually. There are many AI programs out there, and there's an AI assistant in Word 365 that will actually transcribe things for you if you've got a recording. If you have an audio recording, apologies, audio recording, it will transcribe that for you. So everything that has been said, though, needs to be written down. If you're using it in a written paper, a documentable paper, and you're doing it in writing, the format of a transcription is, as the word suggests, script-like, and that you must write down the name of the speaker and what was said. It's a very laborious process, except these days, not so much as it used to be. But you do want to be able to clearly quote from the interview. It will also allow the subject of the interview to look at what was said and decide if they're comfortable with having that shared for publication. Send the transcription to the subject of the interview. Send a copy of the transcription of the interview to the subject of the interview. Ask if there's anything they are uncomfortable with in the interview. Ask if they would like to make an addendum to any of their remarks. This is a terrible thing to get to the defense of your thesis, for example, and have someone that you've interviewed either disavow the interview or tell you that you misinterpreted them. Additionally, most of us do not remember everything we say in conversation, which is essentially what an interview is, a formalized conversation. There are sometimes and they are sometimes surprised by how our words can be interpreted when put into writing. Interview subjects should have an opportunity to make sure that they feel in no way compromised by that you intend to publish. Glean. Look through the interview and decide what parts of the interview support your argument. What quotes are most powerful or insightful? Remember to properly reference each quote. When it comes time to write the thesis or the paper or the article or the report, be sure to include those you interview in the acknowledgments section. Okay, that's a quick overview of what is in this handout. We will be discussing this in the real-time session again, but if you have questions about what you need to do here, please let me know. And again, whatever you complete in this section of your hypothetical interview, you would copy out, and then let's come back here and let's say ideally you are, let's get to our course actually, apologies. So research, and when you get to the comprehensive form, let's make sure you have it open. And there's going to be that section in our report in which interview instrumentation, in this case, here we go, interview instrumentation. So you're going to need to answer those questions. Please list the questions that would be used, what sort of preparation would be necessary, what kind of questions you ask in order, why, and then please share the instrument. So you will answer those questions, and you will also add, you'll answer those questions, but you'll also add your interview itself. So it's not letting me paste. I wonder if I actually copied that properly. Yes, I did. Okay. All right. And you'll want to put that right in there. And then when you adapt for the survey, it's going to be slightly different because that will be a survey exercise. That will be part of the information for another day.